Over on this channel, I've shot out my fair share of praise for Thomas Frank and his Tottenham team. But what is happening right in this moment is not something I can hide from. Tottenham are not Tottenham. Tottenham are tasteless, toxic, tacky, and tragically absent when dealing with the task of scoring any goals, creating any chances, displaying any real idea, intent, any passing patterns when it comes to actually threatening an opposition. A manager that's well respected for his pragmatism and adaption to opposition now seems too hyper-focused on the opposition itself, fearful of opposition no matter the shape or size. The Lilywhites' decline in recent months has been clear, so today we'll be analysing what blew right up in our faces yesterday, which was Ebere Eze and Arsenal strolling all over Tottenham. Now, Arsenal in this game, of course, were very good and there were some fantastic individual displays, but I just couldn't look past how bad Tottenham were, not just tactically, but in terms of the players themselves as well. So far in the Premier League this season, Frank's side are responsible for the two worst performances in XG output this season. Now, a lot of people don't like XG and quite complex statistics, which is completely fair enough, but XG evaluates the quality of chances you create. Spurs have been struggling to create chances, let alone quality chances, so this stat is relevant. Spurs are fourth from bottom in XG total so far this season, seeing themselves below the likes of Wolves, Leeds, Fulham and West Ham. And it's no wonder they are this low, seeing the monumental amount of distance they are shooting from against Arsenal yesterday, as you can see from the shot map. Not a single shot anywhere near the goal or penalty box, with the only goal being a terrific freak and spontaneous strike from Richarlison. Spurs have overall scored a lot of goals this season, but if you are overperforming your XG by a considerable amount and you are not sustainably creating chances, it's going to catch up with you. It's inevitable. Superb performances at Manchester City, PSG in the Super Cup and more suggested that Thomas Frank would be cooking up some solid game plan, a master plan that would sustain and nullify the Gunners in their title hunt. But this was not the case whatsoever. A very defensive lineup aiming for defensive solidity failed in any attempts to show any solidity. Let's have a look at why, what Thomas Frank got wrong and how Arsenal exposed Tottenham. So if we start with the two lineups, then as we can see, loads of people were talking about Gabriel missing for Arsenal. Well, truthfully in this game, I don't think anybody noticed it because Spurs hardly attacked, of course. But Tottenham, if we focus on the Tottenham setup, you had Richarlison, Kudus and Odegaard up front. Not the most clinical front three, but they're not exactly spoiled for choice in options at the moment, with the likes of Maddison and Kulusevski and Solanke out. Five at the back was somewhat not expected, but almost anticipated. You wasn't surprised. And there's no problem with the five at the back. Frank has used it many times to good effect. But it was the execution of it. And Palhinha and Bentancur, probably the negative pivots that Spurs have been talking about, but what you expect them to be good at, they were not good at against Arsenal. It was a poor watch. Now, honestly, I thought Thomas Frank going into this game with this three at the back was going to be much more elaborate than it actually was. Now, Arsenal within their setup is their usual setup, to be honest with you. Calafiori is floating, Eze and Moreno rotating, with Moreno being that false nine. You had Rice dropping in deep, Zubimendi floating and dropping in deep, whilst Timber actually had a little bit more license to roam, I noticed, with the low possession state Arsenal found themselves in, considering Spurs just sat off. But Spurs for me were really underwhelming. I was expecting a Manchester City-like setup where Romero was going man-to-man with Haaland, they had a high press, they were doing really well, they cramped Manchester City in their own half, but we saw absolutely none of this. The first few minutes, I thought there was some elaboration to Tottenham's setup. You had Palhinha and Bentancur slightly pushing up, looking to pin Arsenal back, force them backwards, and make it a really tricky setup for Arsenal to face. Except the centre-backs were not jumping, so there was all of this space that Arsenal could punch the ball through to Moreno, to Timber, to Eze, to Calafiori. All of this space that the centre-backs weren't covering. For some reason, the centre-backs were not going man-to-man. Sometimes Danso would be attracted by Calafiori, who came within this left half space, but again, that would leave too much space for Ebere Eze. So Danso was very hesitant within this department. If Spence shifts across, that leaves Trossard with so much space. So it was a really tricky setup for them to deal with. And overall, I thought the non-man-to-man setup, I think, would have been hindered by the fact that Arsenal didn't have Victor Gyökeres. It wasn't very clear because Arsenal were constantly fluid and rotating, so I don't think that Thomas Frank was confident in setting up a man-to-man trap, a man-to-man system against a very fluid, a very false nine rotating Arsenal system. Truthfully, I don't think he really knew what to expect in terms of, okay, if we have Romero here, then they're just going to rotate with Eze and it's just going to cause too much room. So I think he was a little bit fearful of Arsenal. So Spurs just ended up sitting back in this 5-2-3 that sort of turned into a 5-4-1. However, it wasn't so sharp to cover in that space because the half spaces, because the centre-backs were not shifting, not jumping, were just completely free to Arsenal to play through. But the biggest problem for Tottenham Hotspur for me was not the fact that the half spaces were free. I mean, it is because you're giving Eze all that free room, as you saw with the goals, but it was out wide. It's almost as if they came with a little bit of elaboration to their setup. They realised that, okay, Arsenal are playing through us, we need to sit back a bit, but we're going to make up for that proactivity in shifting across the wide spaces. Well, Thomas Frank would have put a lot of emphasis in shifting across the wide spaces so that you can force Arsenal back. But if you're leaving all of this free space in and around here where players particularly excel, particularly with Ebere Eze, then that is just not a good game plan whatsoever. I think for the goal, the first goal for Ebere Eze, there was about 7 players shifted across, even Romero, even Danso. So that is just so much free room to simply pass through. I don't know why there are so many players shifting across. I don't know why the midfield pivots are both shifting across as well. They're both very energetic, but there can't be 2 places at once. One would have been just enough with one in and around here. And Kudus and Richarlison, although they were deep a lot, they were deep because Arsenal dominated the ball, not because they were particularly good off the ball. Kudus didn't really get back that much, so that left Calafiori to just enjoy his roaming days, to be honest with you, just to float around. So this was schoolboy stuff, and Arsenal were overloading one flank to isolate the other. Funnily enough, this is how Tottenham Hotspur beat Manchester City, in a little bit more direct fashion. Arsenal were passing more intricately, and in the end, it worked. It created so much space for Eze here, or if it was Eze and Moreno rotating, it would have been Moreno. It was schoolboy stuff by Tottenham, but it was essentially a broken setup that Thomas Frank just got completely wrong. I was surprised by how poor it was, but also at the same time, with how bad Spurs have been at the moment, it was all going to come crashing down if nothing was going on off the ball. I thought off the ball as well, the wing-backs were sometimes aggressive. I thought Spence wasn't good enough in the first half. Second half, he was much more aggressive. In terms of a doggy, he was very aggressive too. Bukayo Saka, but I think ultimately a bit more too aggressive, and it's not as if he nullified the threat of Bukayo Saka. But on the ball, there was also not a lot going on whatsoever. We can see that, we saw that, and we can see that also within the data. Just 3 shots and 0.07 XG. Those are Burnley numbers. Those are the sort of numbers that you expect from Burnley playing away at Arsenal. And I think when Burnley played against Arsenal recently, they did a much better job attacking them than Tottenham Hotspur did. Tottenham also had 4 touches in the opponent's box, 0 successful crosses, and despite the set piece inspiration, despite Tottenham looking for marginal gains and looking for set pieces to be that cutting edge, they only earned one corner kick. Now in possession it was very interesting. If you're looking to be a bit more counter-attacking and clinical on the break, then I can't quite understand as to why Pedro Porro was dropped. Jed Spence can be explosive in his sprinting. Porro's not been amazing this season, to be honest with you, but Porro is one of Tottenham's most creative players. He can hit a ball quite fantastically. Whether that's a cross, whether that's shooting, he's a good ball striker. Xavi Simons for me as well was an interesting one. Although he's not been on form, he is one of Tottenham's most creative assets. He's good running into open space. I imagine in transition, Xavi Simons could have been used a little bit more effectively. But on the ball, there was absolutely nothing going on. You've got the least progressive pivot in the league with Paulinho and Bentancur. You'd think for a five at the back that actually you could sacrifice one of them. Play Paulinho and then maybe Archie Gray or Bergvall. But no, it was Paulinho and Bentancur, which could have worked if the execution of the system was a little bit more stronger. But the build-up play was really quite poor. Arsenal in their usual 4-4-2 off the ball, as expected. Essentially the ball just came back to Vicario or Romero every time, where Romero was expected to punch the ball through the lines to Richarlison. Now even if the ball did get to Richarlison, physically he hardly won a single duel against those Arsenal centre-backs. Of course they are so athletically and physically superior, but he was quite pathetic in that instance. And it's not as if Kudus and Odegaard were close to him to really feed off him. They were dropping in deep within these spaces, and I felt it was more so Bentancur and Paulinho that were feeding off Richarlison, not the players that actually should be in and around these spaces. And with how poor Paulinho and Bentancur were to those second balls within these areas, they didn't win anything. They're just getting carved open, and Arsenal were pinning them right in their own half. If they tried to funnel the ball out wide to Van der Ven or Doggy, then Saka was trapping a Doggy inside. Despite Spurs' somewhat reliance on that right side, with Porro and Kudus, they've been quite reliant on progressing down the right. There was no progression down the right whatsoever, particularly in that first half. And then the ball came back to Vicario, where Arsenal fans were encouraging him to play on the ball because he's so shaky. His kicking, his distribution, his composure, his footwork is honestly quite poor. So even if they did try to play through to Richarlison, Declan Rice, Zubimendi, the very athletically powerful midfield, were getting to it, and Tottenham were essentially causing their own problems. Their own problems being caused by the lack of passing ideas, build-up, lack of overloads, lack of anything. It was the wrong personnel within this game, and it was a really difficult watch. Whenever the ball did come to Mohamed Kudus or whenever the ball came to Wilson Odegaard, for me I felt they were really isolated. It was like a 1v1 and sometimes 2v1, and Odegaard and Kudus, they're two good players on the ball, but if they're isolated, one in Odegaard is very raw and Kudus can be very wasteful. So the pair of them were very wasteful. Spurs could not retain the ball. Those two could not retain the ball. Nobody could retain the ball. There was no outlet. There was no Doggy sprinting forward and running into the open space on the flank for them to escape. There was absolutely no escape. So they were just recycling the ball to the point where, yeah, we're just going to give it to Arsenal back. We're going to fumble under pressure, and Thomas Frank for me has got to build more passing fluidity in terms of build-up. Of course you can go long, but there's no outlet to go long. I think if the idea was to go long quite a lot to Richarlison, use him as a hold-up play specialist, then Pape Sarr, a second ball magnet, probably could have helped here. But the game's over. The setup was wrong, and it was probably one of the most toothless displays I have ever seen from a Big Six team. I have ever seen since Tottenham played Chelsea a few weeks ago. That's how poor Tottenham are at the moment. If you enjoyed today's video, make sure to smash a like and subscribe to the channel. What did you think of the performance against Arsenal? It was pretty bad, I know. What do you think of Thomas Frank at the moment? I've seen a lot of people turn their head at him. I've seen a lot of people backing him at the same time. For me, Thomas Frank, he deserves the criticism at the moment. I'm not completely stubborn to the idea of the fact that he may fail at Tottenham. Many have tried, many better have tried and failed, but if you were shouting about Thomas Frank in the summer, you were probably shouting and embracing the long-term aspect of Thomas Frank, the solidity, the player development. Of course, that's not been seen so far, but I think he deserves a little bit more time than 15 games before he's sacked. But let me know your thoughts below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.